Let's talk.
Charles Brown.
War Babies, the untold story of the silent generation, is a collection of interviews with men and women from the silent generation, those born between 1928 and 1945, about their childhood experiences during World War II. I'm delighted to say that we are joined by the authors of War Babies, who are Chris Manby and also Simon Robinson. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you. Just good to have you with us both. Just explain, because Christine, you're an author, and Simon, you're a social historian. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what's the general premise been? What was the spark that gave you the idea to write this book then?
Shall I go for it, Simon?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So what was the spark? So Simon and I had worked together on some books with World War II veterans, and we realised while we were talking to them about their families, their wider families, that some of the younger generation people in their families had just as exciting stories, really. And so we thought we'd give them an opportunity to share them.
And, growing up, you hear so many of the war stories from like grandparents and neighbours of grandparents, and growing up in kind of the 80s, 90s kind of period into the early 2000s, there was so many people that had these stories. It became something that anybody over 70 could tell you a story about the war. And then we've kind of got to this point now where to have served in the war, you've got to be around 100 years old. And the children of those war years are in their 80s, their 90s. And it was important to try and capture as many of those stories as we can, because I think there's so much resilience to be found in them. They were really dealing with extraordinary circumstances in their lives. And I think as a generation, it's made those people that are kind of, 75 plus, they are a very resilient generation, really.
Because one of the things that the Second World War does to our parents. I mean, our grandparents fought most of them would have fought or served in the Second World War, but our parents were born in that generation, and it was a conflict. Spanish Civil War notwithstanding, where for the first time civilians were a part of this, and because other wars were fought. I mean, the occasional Zeppelin raid over London notwithstanding during the First World War, the war has a direct and immediate effect on populations. Obviously, people go, okay, the Blitz and the bombing. I know we're talking about blitzes both in, Glasgow, Belfast, Bristol, Plymouth, etc., not only as just London, but also the upheaval, children being moved into the countryside. Many of them had no idea. So it was a war where the front line was the civilian population as well as those serving on the front. Christine.
That's absolutely right. So many of the people that we spoke to have experienced the most extraordinary things. You can't quite believe it. And they talk about it with such sort of humility and stoicism. But yeah, they were under fire. One of our interviewees, Dot Clary, was in a shelter in the back garden when their house was hit by a bomb, and all the rubble fell on the shelter, and they were buried in that shelter for goodness knows how long, in the dark, just her mum and her two toddler brothers. Extraordinary things to have gone through. Yeah. And
Simon, how do you sort of get, because I mean, every street surely in areas in sort of, and again, it's primarily where there are docks, for example. So we're looking at most famously, London Docklands, which one of the reasons it was redeveloped was the fact that a lot of it was flattened, and the same goes for Plymouth, for example, and Bristol, and Liverpool. I mean, everybody's got everybody's got a tale like that, and for those of us who were children in the 70s can remember going to places like Liverpool and there being, before it all got, and my mother's from Glasgow, and before it all got sort of revamped, there were these huge areas of devastation, and there's going to be the buildings didn't just fall down, they were bombed. So how do you sort of sort through the histories that you're getting, Simon?
Well, the thing is, yes, those city areas, there was the idea of trying to hit dockland areas and real centres of infrastructure. But there are also very tragic stories of tip and run raids, bombers that are flying back over quiet little villages that are not prepared for air raids. No one expected that a bomb was going to fall on a small village or a small holding, something like that. And they're not prepared for that. And also the heartbreaking decisions of parents to send their children away in evacuation to a place in the safety of the countryside that then would turn out perhaps not to be safe. And all sorts of reasons why it would not be safe. But to give you an obvious example, there were some children from a school in Colchester that were evacuated away to the Midlands. And actually, Quiet Village School, that school is bombed and those children are killed. The parents, absolutely fine. Back in the town. So actually, the Baedeker raids in 42 that were targeting, these smaller kind of, tourist areas, really, not areas of great national importance. So actually, this is some of the surprising things that come out of it. It's not always those big city centres that are always, they bore the brunt of things, but so too, comparatively, did these small towns and villages.
I suppose one of the things is these are terror raids, aren't they? They are supposed to upset and demoralise the population. And the RAF are doing the same thing, of course, over things like Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg. But the idea is to destabilise the population, and especially in the early days of the war, where you've got the phony war, and then there's and we see the pictures, and I remember seeing these pictures of babies in gas masks, which seem to be these huge sort of almost like you could go scuba diving in them. But at the time, we kind of forget that because we have that look at history because we know how it pans out. But at the time, you have no idea, and the absolute fear if you're a parent with and having to put the thought of being gassed with your newborn baby must have been palpable, Christine.
Yes, well, I mean, that fear sort of comes through. One of our war babies, Violet, talks about how her mother was very, very scared, and that sort of translated through to her, it transmitted to her, and her mother would always say to her, I don't understand why you're so much more difficult than your little brother. And eventually Violet realised, well, it's because I was raised with you constantly telling me, if you hear a doodlebug, stop, it's going to drop on the house. That was the bedtime story. It's absolutely how horrifying it must have been for those parents to have to parent in war. But my goodness, the children bore the brunt. They really did, I think.
And what's the? We seem to have this idea because we tend to look back at history with sort of rose-tinted spectacles, if you would. That it was all everybody got together and it was all very cheery, and Hitler's only got one proverbial songs, and I always think of the brilliant John Borman film Hope and Glory. Where at the end, the bomb hits the school where they're all out, and he's like, "School's been cancelled." Thank you, Adolf. I mean, are we correct in thinking that although it was a terrible time, communities pulled together, or are we reading too much in it? Because there was still criminality, there was still a black market. So I mean, how much do you have to sort of to sort of sift through? The urban legend, as it were, or the folklore behind it?
I feel quite strongly about the idea of community spirit and the people pulling together, simply because for 25 years I've spoken to people that were there that talk about that community spirit, that idea, you're bombed out and a neighbour takes you in, or, you've lost all of your clothes in a raid and somebody else gives up some of their rationed clothes, for you. So that community spirit was definitely there. And I think that there was a lot of positive messages that were being sent out, whether, we talk about propaganda in that period, but actually, the music, it was key. Even the people that were children then talk about those sorts of songs. I think it's something of a whole community that are pulling together, all experiencing the same sort of thing. But you're quite right. Yes, crime went through the roof in wartime. It was a kind of a heyday, really, of gangsters and black marketeers and, people dabbling in getting hold of black market goods and that sort of thing. People were living from day to day under the pressure of, live and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So that that spirit. You know, everything, class barriers broke down. Some of what we would perceive or what they perceived at the time as moral barriers also broke down. You know, people were living under extreme circumstances. There'd been a real movement after the First World War. Look at the reaction of the 1920s and the Jazz Age. And yes, okay, if you're wealthy, you're enjoying more of that kind of thing than people who are just trying to make ends meet at the end of the day. But the 1930s, there was a real kind of conservatism that had come in, you know, which is a reaction against the 20s. And then we get that kind of in the 40s, the war years, the austerity, and then that lovely kind of 1950s reaction to
Here's the thing, because, I mean, we live now in a world of TV. And well, TV, if you're lucky. I mean, everybody's got the world on their smartphones. And, you know, you mentioned a situation where every home's sort of most homes have got a wireless, shall we say, a valve operated wireless. And then you get the Americans turn up. And they must have seemed like something from it, because I mean, you know, you're a kid, you're watching Saturday morning Picture House films, aren't you? So, you know, America is cowboys and Indians and all that sort of stuff, and Flash Gordon. And suddenly, there standing in front of you is probably an African American or an American full stop or a Canadian, and you must think they've arrived from planet Zog. I mean, what sort of reaction did you get any reaction from sort of the arrivals of the Americans, sort of pre D-Day?
Yes, we did. Well, one of our war babies, her father was one of those GIs that arrived pre D-Day, so they certainly made a difference to her life. And perhaps Simon, you can talk about Derek, lovely Derek, and his Americans.
Absolutely, Derek spoke with such joy about the arrival of the Americans. And, you know, it's fact, got any gum chum was the thing that these British kids had learnt to say. And certainly these Americans brought with them, you know, Glenn Miller and all of that music, but they also brought with them access to things. Some of these children who were born just before the war or in the early war years, they hadn't seen things like Coco and things like that. And so, you know, Derek said, well, he used the word, he said, we used to pester them. He said they were always really, really kind, and they used to give us things. And sometimes when they didn't give them things, the children also organised their own kind of commando-style raids where they would get into the back of a Jeep and help themselves to a tin of something, take it back and put it on the table at home. There's a tin of peaches. I mean, these were absolute luxuries. Another child who was a child during the war locally told me about this GI who gave him a tin that turned out to be, it was cocoa powder. He took it back to his grandmother. He said, what's this now? And what's this? And she said, it's cocoa. And, you know, that was their first taste. But also with that, there was this kind of bittersweet thing of knowing all of these Americans with their, you know, great teeth and uniforms and music and, you know, them going off and dancing in village halls with, you know, the local women, all this kind of thing. They all of a sudden disappear overnight with D-Day. And a lot of these children really missed these people who'd become their friends because these men were far from home. And it was nice to be around people, get that sense of a family life. However, Chris and I have also spoken to people that are, you know, 100, 102, who do talk about, you know, oversexed, overpaid over here, which was another kind of reaction from some of the population.
Yeah, I mean, if you're sort of a Tommy and you've been in the BEF and just made it back from Dunkirk, and then you've been in the 8th Army or whatever, and then you know you get back on leave and there's a bunch of Americans everywhere. You're not with great uniforms and wonderful music and perfect teeth. You're going to feel a bit, if your name's Archie, you're going to feel a bit sort of a bit miffed, I think the word is, Chris.
Yes, absolutely. And the GIs did actually get a special little booklet of instructions in which they were expressly, informed that they had to be very careful about local sensitivities because they were so much better paid. And they were also told not to take the mickey out of our tea as well, or our teeth, I suppose.
Teeth and beer, and tepid beer, I'd imagine.
Exactly. Yeah.
Here's the thing. Is it purely based in the British experience, or do you look at what was happening in other countries during this time?
Well, we do have a wonderful story in there from a lady called Olga Henderson, who was a child prisoner of war in the Far East in Singapore.
Oof.
Yeah, and her experience is extraordinary. Actually, our book shows just a very small section of her experience because, I mean, her story is a book in itself, and indeed it is a book. But she was a part of a girl guide group in Changi jail in Singapore, and they had to hide that they had this guiding group from the Japanese who had forbidden any sort of gatherings of people. And they made a fantastic quilt, which is now in the Imperial War Museum in London. But she talks about when they were sewing the quilt, if they saw a Japanese guard coming along, she'd have to tuck it up in her knicker elastic so that they couldn't find the sewing. And recently, Simon and I went to the Imperial War Museum with her to see the quilt, and now they bring it out in this archive box, and the lighting has to be low, and it's such a precious thing. But she was just a little girl who was shoving her sewing, up her shorts all those years ago.
And it was so poignant standing there with her while she pointed to her eyesight isn't brilliant, but she wanted to make sure she could read every name that was sewn onto this quilt, and she knew something about each person. And then there was that really poignant moment when she said, "I think I'm the last person here." She was desperately hoping to find a friend called Ozzie Hancock, that she never knew what happened to her after the war when they were all split and sent to different countries, repatriated and that kind of thing. And I've always hoped that, we tried with the Australian Red Cross and, just sort of hit a few dead ends and things, but hopefully someday.
Here's the thing, because that story itself is poignant and bittersweet, but we tend to look at history as something that happened. When people will say to me, why do you like history so much? Why do you all got your head in the book about the Plantagenets? It's hundreds of years ago. And it's like, yeah, but it's the personal stories. It's shaped who we are today. And the thing, especially with World War II history, is the fact that it is literally that the veil is very thin on that one. So you only have to standing by that woman as she looked at something she hadn't seen since she was a girl, must have brought home, this is why you do what you do, because it is a living history. And that's why it shouldn't be forgotten. And it's not all about great strategic sweeps across Europe. It is about those personal stories, Chris.
That's absolutely right. And one of the great things about doing this book is that we've been able to help some of the people that we worked with to find out a little bit more about the history. We've been able to research, what happened on the night that bomb fell, which houses were destroyed, that kind of thing. And one of our lovely ladies, Jean, she was evacuated to a village near Reading at the beginning of the war. And while she was there, her mother and her sister were killed in the Blitz. And so she never went home because the home was destroyed. She never went home again. She stayed in the countryside until she was 14 and left school and was old enough to go to work. And until we started working on this book, she didn't actually know where her mother and her sister were buried. And so we were able to find that out. And we were also able to show her their entry in the Civilian Book of Remembrance, which she didn't know about either. So that kind of thing has made this project very special, and also reminded me and Simon, I know, what an impact those 5 years had on the generation and the generations that followed as well. Because Jean's children didn't know anything about her mother either, or where her mother was. So it's been really special. And
do you think that because this generation go on to enjoy the late 50s, early 60s, they are that boomer generation is now called, and they enjoy a period perhaps of you've never had it so good, as Macmillan put it. I mean, do you think that's if you listen to the song lyrics and you think about the times, it is an awful lot of it is about the war, an awful lot of it is about so and so serving over there, and the restructuring of Britain and the destruction of the empire. I mean, it kind of, those events really shaped the history of our grandparents, our parents, and indeed us. And is that perhaps, Simon, what you're looking at here?
It's really extraordinary to see how people's lives were shaped by the war. The so much of kind of living through the rationing and that kind of thing stayed with them. You know, they're a generation that, although they will have lived through the never had it so good period, they didn't really take it all for granted. There was always this threat of things like the Cold War. You know, it was all quite possible. They'd lived through the idea of shelters at night and things. So then when the government are putting out leaflets talking about, you know, being ready for nuclear war, all of this kind of thing, you know, this was something they'd been used to seeing, those pamphlets and things. So there's a backdrop to that. But what was really interesting for us as well was seeing how people's lives did change. So, you know, there was a lady, Anne Hay, who I had a correspondence with about 25 years ago, you know, and late teens, and to actually find out more about her life, kind of, you know, in the 50s, 60s, that sort of thing as well was really interesting, because sometimes, you know, we think of people within just a period of 6 years, but actually it's 6 years out of someone's life. But if it's 6 years of your formative years, that's an extremely powerful period. And I kind of feel like a bit of a call to action that I kind of like to say to anybody that was listening was, do talk to parents and talk to grandparents, and don't be put off when they say, oh, well, I didn't really do anything, or, oh, well, it's very quiet where I was. Keep going with those questions. Keep going, because you never know what stories are going to be there.
Are we talking about pestering again, aren't we, Simon? That's actually a word for the day.
Absolutely.
Christine, what are you hoping that people are going to take from War Babies?
Well, I hope it's going to give them a better understanding of why that generation of people are the way that they are. I mean, for me, it's given me a greater understanding of my own parents, and in particular my dad. I lost my dad in 2016, and I very much regret that I didn't ask him more about his own experience during the war. He was born in 1938, so he remembers sort of the latter period. But talking to the war babies, as I call them, has really brought me closer to him, because it's made me understand, you know, just what it was like, you know, and so I'm very grateful to them for that. So I hope that anybody reading it will sort of understand why, you know, why their dad would go on at them for leaving food, or why they had a big box of nails in the cupboard, that kind of thing. You know, the make do and mend.
The book is called War Babies, The Untold Story of the Silent Generation. Listeners, you can go to the TRE Virtual Bookstore, click on the front cover, and it'll be winging its way to you via a well-known distribution service. Where can people find you online? Simon, do you have a website? Do you stalk the social media? Where can people find you, Simon?
I'm unfortunately, I should just have like some old Remington typewriter and a phone. So I'm nearly
a dial phone, obviously, one that goes round, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. With my wireless and my gramophone, Chris is much more modern.
Yes, exactly. I'm 10 years older than Simon, but I am much more modern, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Chris Manby, and I'm very happy to chat to anyone there. And if anybody has a story, do please tell us.
Wonderful stuff. Well, the book is called War Babies. It's by Chris Manby and Simon Robinson. Both of you, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.